So welcome again to this Ask With Education Forum. My name is Bridget Terry Long, and I'm very proud to be the Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I'm delighted to welcome you to this critical conversation as part of the Ask With Education Forum, our signature lecture series, bringing leaders in education in the field to our community to share knowledge, experience, and insights. This forum was established to strengthen the intellectual life of the school through the exchange of ideas, conversation, and debate. And today, we will be talking about the consequences of the pandemic remote and hybrid learning for student achievement in high and low-income schools, and discussing strategies to help students recover academically while addressing their intertwined and critical social and emotional needs. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. Today's episode is being recorded and will be available to view on the Harvard Education YouTube channel and Facebook page. You can also visit gse.harvard.edu/askwith for recordings and information on future sessions. Please submit your questions today through our Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You will also find closed caption access as well there. Now today, HGSE is very proud to host this Ask With Education Forum entitled Planning for an Equitable Recovery, using COVID funding to lift learning and support every student. In a moment, we're going to hear from Tom Kane, HGSE's Walter H. Gale Professor of Education and Economics, and the Faculty Director of the Center for Education Policy Research, or CEPR, at Harvard University. CEPR works with over 150 education districts and state agencies and has deployed over 600 data strategists around the country to help schools to use evidence to inform their decision-making. Today, Tom is going to discuss a study he did with co-authors using testing data from 2.1 million students between 3rd and 8th grade in 49 states, plus the District of Columbia. And they investigate the impact of the pandemic and move to remote and hybrid instruction on learning and achievement. The effects have been staggering, just to give you a bit of a preview. And as we're going to hear in a moment, we really need to seriously consider the implications in the larger context of the efforts to keep our communities safe, but also to invest and support in our students moving forward. This research was supported by grants from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Walton Family Foundation, and Kenneth C. Griffin. And the report was a collaborative effort between the Center for Education Policy Research here at Harvard University, NWEA, and Calder at the American Institutes for Research, or AIR. Now, I'm very pleased to welcome our guests who will be joining Tom on a panel after he briefly presents the results from the study. First, we have Roberto Rodriguez, who is the Assistant Secretary of the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development at the U.S. Department of Education. Next, we have Elias Samuel, who is the President and CEO of the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL. And finally, we have Penny Schwinn, Commissioner of Education for the state of Tennessee. And now I turn the spotlight over to Tom.
Great. So thank you, Bridget. Can everybody see my slides now? So thanks, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. There were many valid reasons that school districts could make different decisions about remote and hybrid learning last year, including substantial uncertainty about the public health consequences of in-person schooling. So our point is not to revisit those questions, those decisions, but rather just to assess what were their consequences for student achievement. Now, we try to answer 4 research questions in this paper. Number 1, incidence, like were high poverty schools more or less likely to remain in remote hybrid instruction last year during 2021? Second, how was achievement growth affected when schools shifted to remote hybrid instruction? Third, differential impact. Did the shift to remote hybrid instruction have different impacts by race, ethnicity? And then finally, is the federal aid that was provided long before we knew anything about the magnitude of these losses, is the federal aid likely to be sufficient for academic recovery? The data we're going to use come from two main sources. The Return to Learn tracker from AEI tracked weekly data on instructional mode between September 2020 and June 21. Their data covers 98% of regular K-12 districts with 3 or more schools. Our second main source of data is from NWEA, one of our research partners for this project. The NWEA MAP test in many ways is ideal for doing what we're trying to do because it's an adaptive test. So it allows you to gauge students' growth in achievement when they're below grade level, as so many students are right now during the pandemic. As Bridget mentioned, there are 2.1 million students in 10,000 schools in 49 states in our sample, and we're focusing on grades 3 to 8, math and reading, although the results I'll talk about today are the math results. So the first point is that high poverty schools around the country spent more weeks in remote instruction, but the gap was particularly large in states where a higher share of all schools spent time remote. So for instance, it was like a 10-week gap in the number of weeks schools were remote in certain states like California, Virginia, Washington, Illinois. There's another group of states where there were also gaps between high and low poverty schools, but there were just much smaller levels of remote learning to begin with. So including states like Florida and Texas. Now, as I mentioned, we looked at the impacts of this remote and hybrid instruction on achievement growth, basically just comparing achievement growth during the pre-pandemic period to the pandemic period. And one of the things that we noticed was that in areas that did not shift to remote instruction, where very few schools were in remote instruction, students lost ground about 20% of a school year, but the losses were similar for low, middle, and high poverty schools. It was where schools went remote, in the districts that went remote, where high poverty schools were disproportionately impacted. So the previous slide just noted that there was a higher incidence of remote instruction for high poverty schools. What this slide is saying is there was a disproportionate impact when schools did close for high poverty students. Now, just another way to show that is in areas that were completely in person last year. Gaps did not widen very much by school poverty or by race. It was primarily in places that were remote or hybrid for part of the year where gaps widened substantially. Now, we also wanted to ask, okay, the federal government has provided about $190 billion to state and local agencies to help with pandemic recovery. That aid was got out the door in record time, but before we knew just the extent of the achievement losses. So one way to gauge just whether or not the aid is sufficient is to first just ask, okay, what was the share of a year's instruction that was lost? Now, the NWEA data are ideal for answering this question because students take the NWEA at different times of the year. And so NWEA gets to see how test scores vary depending on what week students take the test. So we converted the losses in achievement growth into instructional weeks and just ask, okay, what share of a year's instruction was lost? And so a lower bound estimate of what it's going to cost to catch up is what was the share of a school district's annual budget that would have been represented by those lost instructional weeks. And as you can see here, is that in the higher poverty districts that spent more than half of the year remote or hybrid, students lost about 40% of the school year. Now we can compare that to the amount of aid that they received from the 3 different aid packages that Congress passed and the president signed. And as you can see, for the districts that were fully in person, the losses, the blue bars, were lower, were not as high as the amount of aid that those districts received. So those districts are going to have federal dollars over and above the dollars that would be required just for academic catch-up. It's the high poverty districts, though, that where the share of the year lost, the share of an annual budget that would be needed to make up for those lost weeks, is similar to the amount of aid that they received from the federal government. So high poverty districts that went remote would need to spend nearly all the aid for academic recovery. Now, between January and March of this year, the National Assessment of Educational Progress the students were assessed. And even though those results won't come out until October, based on our results, we would predict that the race and ethnic gaps are going to sharpen, sharply widen when those results come out this fall. And so those results are already in the can. And so what we're talking about now is, what can we be doing over the next couple of years to ensure that this widening in gaps does not become permanent? And so we're going to be continuing this project. So this is the first in a series of reports that we're calling the Road to Recovery Project. The next reports will focus on the efficacy of different COVID catch-up interventions that districts are trying. We're working with 14 urban districts around the country, enrolling about 800,000 students. And those districts have been tracking which kids are getting tutoring, which kids are going to after school programs, which schools are in summer school. And in our next reports, we'll be reporting out, okay, so what kind of gains are those students making, and are they making larger gains? And again, it's on us to make sure that the scale of the recovery efforts districts are planning are commensurate with the losses that we've seen, that we need to work together to make sure that these losses don't become permanent. Okay, so thank you, Bridget. If I can figure out how to stop sharing, I'll turn back the screen.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you to the entire team for that sobering look. I think we all know, as we have experienced the pandemic during the last 2 years, that there have been costs and losses for all of us, but to see the differential impact. So as we move to the panel discussion, we certainly want to focus on, well, what can we do about these gaps, about these losses, or just simply put, how can we support our students looking forward to continue to make progress? Thank you again for joining us. I can already see that some are putting questions using in the Q&A tool, so I encourage you to do so. We're going to get started with the panel, but then I hope to bring in those questions in just a moment. So I want to start with Assistant Secretary Roberto Rodriguez. As Tom mentioned, there are funds available, such as the American Rescue Plan. So funding is available to schools to try to address these needs. Roberto, I'm wondering, given our current reality, what is the federal government's role as we assess all of what Tom has said? How will the U.S. Department of Education take stock and build a pathway of guidance for recovery?
Well, Dean Long, thank you for the opportunity to join you for today's important discussion. I want to applaud the Graduate School of Education for hosting today's conversation. And Tom, thank you for this study, and to your colleagues at NWEA and at Calder as well for enlightening us, providing, I can't think of a more important time to bring our tools around research and data to this challenge that we're facing. The study, I think, points to two really important things. The first is that it reinforces just how important it was to get our schools reopened to in-person learning for all of our students, right? And that has been here at the federal level the number one priority since day one over the last 15 months is to make sure that we're helping to support a safe reopening of our schools, to keep them open, and to really help our students catch up. This has been President Biden's objective. It's why we worked so hard with Congress to try to provide some of the resources that are needed to partner more actively with states and with school districts who are doing the hard work around that reopening. And just think of how much further behind our learners would be today if we hadn't gotten urgently about that business. We have gone from 46% of schools open for in-person instruction back when the administration first took shape to nearly 100% open full-time today. That's really a testament to our educators and to our educational leaders and to our policymakers and system leaders at the local level and at the state level who have really been on the front lines shepherding through this pandemic. The second important lesson here is just how important it is to put these critical dollars to work and to do that urgently, to provide the recovery and the support that our students need to be able to catch up. We are committed here at the department to being a full partner in that effort. We've released an unprecedented amount of volumes of resources to help states and districts steer toward effective approaches, evidence-driven approaches around accelerating and supporting learning recovery, and effective approaches around supporting social and emotional well-being and the mental health of our students. We know that we are amidst a youth mental health crisis in our country today that is connected very largely to the work we need to do around recovering student learning. Our students need to be healthy emotionally and physically. They need to be cared for. We know we've had 140,000 young people who've lost someone to this pandemic, lost a caregiver to this pandemic. So what are we doing to help support their recovery mentally and socially and emotionally? And how are we supporting our states and our district officials to really put these dollars to use in the here and now? That's been our big priority. We've put $130 billion in that ESSER fund down to states. They're getting those dollars to work at the local level. We have budgets taking shape. So it's such a consequential time for us to all work together to support that full recovery for our students.
Okay, thank you so much, Roberto. I want to bring in Penny Schwinn, who is the Commissioner of Education for Tennessee. I know your state has really been focused on improving student success using interventions like tutoring programs. So I'm wondering, can you reflect on how Tom's research is either illustrating and informing, or perhaps running counter to what your state has been experiencing?
Sure, I'm happy to, and really glad to be on this panel, I think, with people who have done incredible work and put out incredible resources. And so in Tennessee, we've seen very similar trends. We saw that those students who were more likely to be in school throughout the pandemic, and candidly in Tennessee, maybe a little different than the rest of the country, all but 3 of our districts were in person essentially all of last year and this year. We only had 3 that stayed kind of remote for the majority of last year. And as a result, we did not see significant differences by income level, different than what we would have seen before the pandemic for those folks who were in person. Now, that being said, when we did look at that remote instruction, we saw a pretty significant divide between our economically disadvantaged students and not, and that crossed whether you were rural or urban districts. That was a really important indicator for us as a state that has some two to 4 very large urban districts, as well as predominantly rural districts. And so part of our response and recovery efforts as a result of kind of the ARP funds, ESSER funds, and GEAR funds has really been focused on where we saw the biggest gaps. We saw that in early literacy. I think the entire country saw it in math. And then certainly we've seen that in the high school space, where we are continuing to struggle to get our high school students more engaged. Even if their bodies are present in school buildings, the engagement level just is not tracking the same. So some of the things that we've done, we have a statewide high dosage tutoring program, Tennessee All Core, which is now codified in law, 150,000 students in K through 8th grade. As a just kind of a comparison point, we've got about 72 to 74,000 students per grade. So it's a very high percentage of overall students will participate in high dosage tutoring. That's no more than 3 students multiple times per week with the same tutor or instructor. We have Reading 360. It's a $120 million program really focused on early literacy. And what we've seen in our universal screener data is that those students who are participating in the early reading interventions and in that high dosage tutoring focused on literacy are showing significantly stronger growth, especially those who are in our low income communities. And we have special tutoring programs that allow for parents to engage in tutoring. And it also allows for wraparound services before and after school for those students who need it. So those have been 2 of the biggest interventions, especially in those younger student spaces. But on the high school space, I think we sometimes take for granted that high school students are so independent, they can help with their own recovery efforts. And we're just not seeing that play out in many of our communities. And so we have a major investment of innovative high schools, reshaping and redesigning what high school can look like. But we are very excited that to partner with those early pilots as a result of the federal program funding that came in is our state legislature just appropriated the recommendation of Governor Lee, and it's $500 million to redesign high school and middle school in every single part of the state. Every high school gets $1 million. Every middle school will get $500,000 so that we can design programs that will get our students back and keep them engaged. We're seeing that those students who are able to participate in those programs, along with other efforts such as AP Access for All, where now every student in the state has access to free, no-cost AP courses, whether they are in a very small rural community or a very large urban community. So innovative courses plus that access to rigorous courses, plus bringing in a lot of different businesses and industry in a way that we couldn't have done before without, I think, this motivation to really engage our students has allowed for us to change the trajectory for our high school students in a way that we would not have seen otherwise. I think the last data point on that, which we are really focused on measurable outcomes, is that we have more students participating in work-based learning and apprenticeships in the state than we had before the pandemic. We actually more than doubled participation during the pandemic because we were able to use some of those federal relief dollars and had a different level of focus about how to keep students engaged and pushing forward. So while we do expect that our NAEP data is going to drop just like everybody else in the country, and we are prepared for that, we are seeing that our data throughout the course of this school year is reflecting that those participating in interventions are progressing and accelerating faster. We are also seeing that having those targets more specifically on our low-income communities with some of those additional supports for our mental health that we've seen across the board as a major issue is going to be important for us. And then the last thing is all of that wraps into summer school. We now have legislation that provides for summer school in every single district. So it adds 6 weeks of instruction in every district, K through 8th grade, plus free 24-hour tutoring for our high school students. So we think all of those together will be a nice comprehensive package. And again, give access to those students who have not had access to in-person instruction in the same way as others.
Hey, thank you so much, Penny. It's very good to hear. There's a lot of action and things that are in the works. Really want to commend Tennessee for also investing the dollars along with the federal dollars. I'll note to our panelists, although we're really focused on the U.S. and we're giving U.S. examples, we do have educators in the audience who are reflecting and agreeing with many of the things that you've brought up, Tom, and that you're discussing, Penny, from Morocco, Nigeria, Belgium, Argentina. Please keep the questions coming in the Q&A. Now, Roberto, you've mentioned, Penny, you as well, so this is not just about academics. We have to think seriously about the mental health and the trauma that has affected our students. So, Aaliyah, I want to turn to you as CEO of the nonprofit that defined the term social emotional learning almost 3 decades ago. Social emotional needs are too often perceived to be as separate from academic needs, setting up this false choice between achievement and wellness, or between achievement and recovery. I'm wondering if we can finally dismantle that false choice.
Thank you so much, Dean Long. And yes, this focus on social emotional learning is not only important and critical here in the US. I actually just returned from Israel yesterday, so I am a bit jet lagged, meeting with the First Lady and the Education Cabinet around a systemic approach to social emotional learning. There is a real recognition that we cannot bifurcate the social emotional learning needs and the academic needs and outcomes of our students. And in order for us to really talk about recovery, we need to make sure that we're talking about them both in tandem and in an integrated way. Students, what we know is students are more likely to excel academically when they are engaged, when they're motivated, when they have those relationships with their peers and with their teachers. And so fundamentally, it's not just about having the doors of the building open, all the while that is critically important. It's what is the connection with the parent community, the larger community, the student themselves, in order to make sure that the engagement is there. Penny mentioned, getting our students back, the engagement, the mental health supports. All of those components are critically important in order to think about academic recovery. We also know that when social emotional learning is prioritized in the classroom, it not only helps students learn and practice the skills that we're talking about for academic achievement, but it also helps teachers connect and motivate their students. So there's not just a benefit for the student, but for the teacher and the broader classroom environment as well. And what we know is that through decades of research, which has been replicated across multiple countries and studies from independent teams, that social emotional learning actually bolsters academic achievement. And while there have been hundreds of studies on SEL, there has not been one study that has ever found a negative impact on academic performance when we talk about SEL, meaning there's no trade-off between the two. And here in the US, I would be remiss without saying that right now there's been a lot of politics around the role of social emotional learning in academics. And what we know is that if we don't focus on the social emotional needs and well-being of our students, the academic recovery that we're desiring to get won't happen. And so we really have to think about not only the student needs, but the parent needs. And we know holistically the disengagement now, where if we look at just absenteeism rates, there are right now, we are looking at an equal number, if not more, students who are absent or disengaged from school than what we found at the peak of the pandemic. And so if we want to talk about engagement, if we want to talk about bringing our students back, it's not the focus on just academics that will get us there. We have to understand the social emotional needs and well-being in order to make those gains.
Thank you, Aaliyah. So Tom, I want to come back to you. And already we're starting to get a number of questions. We've started to hear examples of interventions, hearing what Tennessee's doing, Castle supporting, taking kind of a big view, because I know you've done a great deal of research on interventions that support student learning. What would you prioritize? What would you say are the most effective and hopeful steps that states and districts should be planning for now?
So as Penny said, Penny named a number of them that we're seeing districts trying: high dosage tutoring, double dose math or double dose reading, summer school, and after school programs. Those are the most common kinds of things that we're seeing districts trying. But here's the thing, like for each of those, we have some prior evidence on what kind of effect sizes we should expect. And what we haven't been seeing is people taking that prior literature on effect sizes, multiplying them by like the proportion of kids being served, and then making sure that the things are adding up that to be sufficient, commensurate with their students' losses. So just as an example, the magnitude of losses that we've seen in high poverty schools, so more than 75% free reduced price lunch that were remote for half a year or more last year, the average loss for those schools was about 0.45 standard deviations. I promise not to use the word standard deviation during this call, but I couldn't avoid it. That means like the prior research on the effects of high dosage tutoring suggests that you get about 0.38 standard deviations. So what that means is you could provide a high dosage tutor to every single one of the students in the schools that missed, half of the year last year and still not make up the gap like that. So what we've not seen districts do is say, okay, here's the magnitude of the gap that we've lost. Not only like, here's the menu of interventions to try, high dosage tutoring is about 0.38 standard deviations. Double dose math is about 0.2 standard deviations. Summer school is about 0.09 standard deviations. And have people add up, not just what's on the menu, but what's the quantity that people need to be purchasing from the menu that would be sufficient to close the gap that they're seeing. Now, of course, districts are going to figure this out over time. But we don't have time for them to figure. My fear is that, I've seen very few districts whose current plans are commensurate with their losses. And so that means we're going to go through next school year. And then at the end of next school year, when the state tests are taken, we're going to discover the kids are still way behind. And then those scores will come back in late August of 2023. And that'll still be too late before the 23-24 school year starts. And then they'll be launching, the 23-24 school year will end, and we won't have made up the gap. We don't have time to sort of figure out on the fly that the things that we're trying aren't big enough. We need to be looking now in a prospective way at what are the effect sizes we should be expecting, what proportion of kids are getting served, and do we have an intervention plan in every district that is sufficiently sized to close these gaps. I haven't seen much of that discussion going on in districts, and I wish there were.
Right. So, Tom, I think you're definitely sounding the alarm on just how large this disruption, the impact it's had on our students, not just all students, but the gaps that it's reversing progress that had been made for many years. By the way, you're getting a lot of questions. When will the study be made available?
The plan is this week.
So for everyone who's listening, we will follow up. I know there's a number of things that we've been sharing, policies and so forth. So we'll be sure to follow up with links to direct you to those resources. Roberto, I want to come back to you. I'm already looking at the Q&A. We're getting a lot of engagement. There are a lot of questions about funding and the federal government making commitments. But to get to that question of guidance or even accountability, how do we ensure that the funds that are being devoted by the federal government and by other sources are being used to close learning gaps, that are being used in the most effective and efficient way? There was even an example of a district shifting around money rather than using this as new money to expand what they're doing to try to support student learning.
right? And we want to make sure that these dollars are dollars used alongside other dollars to support that learning. We want to avoid that shifting around that you mentioned, Dean Long, and also just say that, just as Tom mentioned, this is a real call to action, and for us to collaborate and do more to address the challenge at hand, which is learning recovery and regaining some of this lost instructional time for our students. We believe there's $130 billion in ESSER that right now is in the system. That is an unprecedented and historic investment and very needed to be able to help support this recovery for our students and their families. We believe that states have the opportunity, and they should take the opportunity, to invest even more than they are investing right now in this learning recovery effort, right? The congressional framing of the American Rescue Plan has a minimum threshold of 20%. We think much more should be spent than that. And in fact, you've heard from Commissioner Schwinn, she's putting state and local resources to work alongside some of those federal resources to try to get that job done. We need an all hands on deck approach. We need an opportunity that taps the evidence base of what we know works. And fortunately, we have that evidence base already well cultivated. I know that this study will be the first, and we'll look more at efficacy of other interventions that are in play. But last spring, our department put forth a handbook that tried to outline high dosage, high quality tutoring, just as some of the tutoring we're describing and discussing today in place in Tennessee. And, we know that tutoring is more effective when we are using well-prepared paraprofessionals and educators and other school staff to deliver that tutoring, when it's done during the school day, when it's done in an intensive way, at least 3 times a week for at least 30 minutes a day, when it is tied and anchored to high quality, rigorous curriculum, and when it follows the gaps that we know exist, right? So what we heard earlier about, diagnosing the need, whether that's in math, whether that's in literacy and other subjects, which looks different from community to community, and marrying that intervention alongside that need. So we're seeing such, I just admire the work that's underway in Tennessee to that end. And we are seeing it in places around the country. We're seeing Colorado launch efforts. We're seeing New Mexico launch a new tutoring core effort, Oklahoma launching new efforts around high quality tutoring. So we want to see that, and we want to also augment that with high quality instruction. The other leg of the stool here we haven't talked about yet this afternoon is making sure that we have that we're doing more to make sure that we have the staff we need in our schools to get the job done, right? And we're seeing the pandemic posing unprecedented challenges around keeping our staff in our buildings, our teachers, our paraprofessionals, and others. So we've been encouraging the use of these dollars, these American Rescue Plan dollars, to surge the supply for our teacher candidates, surge the supply for recruiting and supporting more adults in and out of school to support their students' learning. And then the last thing I'll just mention is, I don't want us to lose this point that was mentioned earlier around the opportunity to re-envision and to be more innovative. As I've talked to teachers around the country who have weathered 2 years of this pandemic, unprecedented challenges that they never signed up for, around teaching remotely, around connecting more deeply into the lives of their learners at home, connecting with parents. So many of them say to me, I don't want to go back to March of 2020. I want to reinvest and reinvent the system, right? I want to build a more equitable recovery. And so how do we think about redesigning our high schools? How do we think about redesigning our teaching and learning in our classrooms? How do we think about bringing those social and emotional tools that Aaliyah mentions alongside those academic strategies to meet the whole child, And how do we carry that forth for the whole educator, for meeting the needs of the whole educator and responding to those children? So tremendous opportunity there as well here. I don't want to lose the opportunity we have in this pandemic to build something new.
Yes. So thank you, Roberto. I'm going to jump around a little bit because a thread you just picked up on is one that's also been in the Q&A. And it's this question about what about teachers and staff and administrators? On one hand, we're very worried about retaining our teaching staff, especially after the last 2 years. And on the other hand, we're asking them to do more. There's a question about, are we training our teachers and our staff and our administrators to be able to deliver social emotional learning and supports that they need? I want to open it up to all of the panelists, your thoughts about those two issues and what we should do going forward.
So I'll chime in. One of the things I think is important to note, and I say this as a former educator, I was an elementary special education teacher, assistant principal, and principal. And when I think about the needs right now, we cannot expect teachers to do this in isolation or school buildings to do this in isolation. And right now, we've heard the saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, right now, the entire village is stressed and at its max. It's the parents, it's the community, it's the educators. And so we need to holistically think about what are those supports for every level of the community so that kids can thrive and learn, which is why when we talk about social emotional learning supports, when we talk about academic recovery, we have to make sure we're talking about it in threefold, where we're talking about the parent, we're talking about the school, and we're talking about the community, because those three together and combined is really where the magic happens, and not only supporting the social emotional needs and well-being of the students, but the educators and when I say educators, everyone who touches that school building. It's important to understand those needs. And then also, we've seen firsthand with the pandemic how parents were front and center and at the front lines. My boys, I had one child who was a kindergartner at the peak of the pandemic and another one that was in 3rd grade. And so parenting and doing virtual school, and even now the transition back, parents are very active in a different way. And so how can we think about continuing the flexibility of parent engagement and involvement so that parents can be involved? How do we continue to help educators bridge those gaps between the school and the community and having those strong relationships? And so holistically, all the while, so much of the weight of this falls with our educators. We have to make sure that we're bringing in the broader community and parent community as well.
Thank you, Aaliyah. Tom or Penny?
So one thing I just wanted to add is many of the initiatives that districts are considering, like tutoring or after school or even double dose math, would require adding staff rather than just retaining staff, and or adding contractors, adding bodies. And we got to keep in mind that we're trying to do this in a period when, the hottest labor market in a long time. And I worry that we're just not going to be able to implement at the scale that we're going to need with those kinds of interventions alone. I wish more districts were talking about ways to extend the school year next year and the following year, paying existing teachers a lot more, time and a half during those extra time periods to get people to extend. That's going to be so we've already got the buildings, we've already got the teachers hired, the logistical challenges of having to go out and recruit and train and schedule tutors are huge. And so while we're doing that for a subset of students, we ought to also be thinking about, are there ways that we could extend the school year? And we have time now to start planning for next spring and the following spring, not a permanent thing, but as a temporary measure over the next couple of years to ensure that kids catch up.
Absolutely. So Penny, I do want to turn to you, though I know there's a wonderful example, again, from Tennessee, that one of our faculty members, Paul Revel, and one of our alums been involved in with the Navigator program, and in fact, recruiting adults to be mentors and to push in with districts a creative way to use capacity. But if I could ask you actually a broader question.
Yeah.
You gave many wonderful examples of things that Tennessee is doing and commitments that Tennessee is making. There have been a number of questions about for other states, other districts, other countries. How do they get started? How do you make sure that that's feasible to start making progress? And then also, do you think about individual interventions? Some of what you talked about instead was more of a holistic, comprehensive kind of approach. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, happy to. And I think that what you just said was essentially what our approach is. I think there are a lot of different ways to think about this work. We had a strategic plan of gaps and needs before the pandemic. We actually saw that the pandemic just exacerbated those gaps. And so we actually worked the plan that we spent months creating because we saw that we needed to do that just in greater force. And so it was things like academics. We have high dosage tutoring, I think the largest program in the country, but that doesn't work if we don't have exceptional educators and paraprofessionals to support that tutoring. So that linked with a different part of our priorities. We have academics, student readiness, and educators as our three pillars. And so what you'll see in our approach is they aren't just kind of one-off silver bullets to try to get to a short-term fix. I think to what we heard from Professor Kane earlier, it is the idea that this is a long-term investment, and this is going to have to be a recovery where we are measuring progress much tighter than every year. We have to make sure that we're seeing that progress over time and then shifting to approach the needs of individual students. So the tutoring program's been massive, but I think one of the things that has helped us to do that is our Grow Your Own program. We are the first state to have a federally recognized, making teaching a federally recognized apprenticeable profession, which means now in Tennessee, if you register into our apprenticeship program, you can become a teacher for free and you are paid as a paraprofessional to do it. That is bringing in a whole new set of teachers. So while we are seeing some transition, we have about 1,000 vacancies in our state. Our Grow Your Own program, just in the last 2.5 to 3 years, this is all pandemic time period, we've brought in 650 people. And that is, again, in the first 3 years, who are now all becoming teachers for free. They're employed in their districts while they're doing that. It's going to cut our vacancy rate in half 2 years from now. Those folks are in classrooms now serving as those tutors, full-time tutors during the day. Our folks who are in our ed prep programs, our ed prep providers are requiring that their teachers become tutors. And all of these folks are also participating in our summer school program, which again, every district is statutorily now required to have every single summer, K through 8. And that's an additional 6 weeks of school that our students will have. We're targeting in those summer school programs, I think to Professor Kane's earlier point, those students who are in remote instruction, those students who are economically disadvantaged, and based on our benchmark data or end of year data, those students who are not on grade level proficiency. We had 22% of all of our elementary school students in summer school last year. The first year, that was a 3-month advance notice. So it wasn't like we had all year to plan for that. And we expect that to be higher last year. And we did not see those teacher vacancies. I use those data points to just say that I think what has been effective in Tennessee is that we've said, look, we should not, the state, be telling every one of our 147 districts exactly what to do and how to do it. We need to say, these are our big North Stars of how we can approach this big, hairy problem. Here are the resources and supports that we will put and structures we will put into place as a state. And here's our long-term commitment. That long-term commitment being state funding to continue what we found in ESSER. We just passed a new student funding formula last Friday. So it's still new, just signed yesterday, but it's a 20% increase in state funding to our public school systems. It's the largest increase that we've seen ever in Tennessee. It goes into effect the year before the ESSER money runs out. So all of these strong programs we were able to start are now codified in law and funded in law, so we can continue to see those gains in progress. But all of that has to come together when you have a comprehensive plan to show how it fits together. Because I think to Aaliyah's point, we can't have social emotional learning over here and tutoring over there and math over here, because that's not how teachers teach. Teachers teach students in front of them. And so if teachers know, I have these strong instructional materials, I work with a tutor to help my students get impact. I also know that I have 6 extra weeks with them at the end of the year. I'm benchmarking their progress, and we have redesigned our middle and high school so that they stay more engaged. And I have a paraprofessional in the classroom who I am building up to fill the vacancy in the classroom next door. It starts to fit together in a very different way, but it cannot be just about the pandemic. It actually has to be about how we do education better in this country. And that's what I think has been so motivating. But if we as states do not take more responsibility for the data and actually getting it done and implementing, it's just going to feel like waste in 3 years. And I'm very worried about that. So we're really thinking about how do we tell a good story of what the state work has been, what the district work has been, and how do we proactively collect the data on those programs and interventions so we can continue them long past 2024.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I know there's going to be a great deal of interest to learn more about exactly what Tennessee is doing, and Tom will also be sharing research. But Aaliyah, I'd like to go to you because some have noted, in some places, SEL has been restricted. It's been kind of vilified and not purposely not part of investments that states or districts are making. What's your advice to educators who are in those contexts?
Thank you for that. And yes, it is a very real issue and concern. And one of the things I think is critically important is that we have to strip out the politics from education. The educators, the field of education, the system of education is in a very fragile state right now as we recover from the pandemic. And now is not the time. And we know that for every politician, education and workforce is critically important to their platform, their success, whether it's at the state level, whether it's at the federal level. And one of the things that we know is that when you unpack the misinformation around what SEL is and what social emotional learning is, and we really focus on the skills and the competencies that come with social emotional learning, understanding the perspective of others, making good decisions, self-awareness, these are all skills that regardless of if you're in the workforce and you're an employer and you're looking for hires, or you're an educator and you're trying to address the academic needs, these skills are fundamental life skills and it transcends education. And so it's really important for us, and it's one of the things that we're working on very diligently, is to get the research, the evidence, and the information around what social emotional learning is out into the field. Because when you get past the layer of educators, there's many who don't know what social emotional learning is. And so there's a narrative that's being created. And so it is our job to make sure that we get good information out there, but then also to continue to underscore and double click on the fact that these social emotional learning skills are skills that last a lifetime. And also the types of social emotional learning skills, they vary by need of student. There's some students who need to focus more on making good decisions. There's some that need to understand self-management and awareness. And so it's not a universal approach for everyone, but it is an individualized approach. Also, there's a misconception that CASEL is a program provider and that we're pushing out certain types of programs. And all the while we help provide guidance on what evidence-based programs are, the decisions on what type of social emotional learning program is a local control decision. And so we need to continue to allow local communities to make the decisions on what's best for their community, for their children. And that's our job, is to provide the research and the evidence and then pass it over to the communities. And so I think now more than ever, we need to not play politics in education with the future of our society and our country, but then also we can't afford state politics to impact local decisions. We need to continue to allow local control and local decision-making, because those closest to the problem always have the best solutions.
Okay, thank you. Looking at some of the questions, people have asked about special populations that we know have suffered substantially during the pandemic. One being our special education students, and another being our youngest learners, our early childhood students who are now entering elementary school not quite as prepared. What are your recommendations of how we can help address their needs? I open it for any panel member.
Well, Bridget, I think it's important that we acknowledge what's been said here, which is that we know that the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact in exacerbating some of the gaps and some of the inequities that already existed in our system. That certainly has been the case for a number of our children, especially our kids from birth through school entry. So many of them haven't had access to early childhood education. We still lag relative to so many of our peers internationally with respect to access to high quality preschool and high quality early education. That is a high priority that we want to move forward on at the federal level. We also, I would add into that population alongside our special education and students with disabilities, are emergent bilingual students, right? Who over 5 million of our students, many of whom have had interruptions to their language development and high quality bilingual education programs. These are fields where also we have extreme shortages, I think, across the country, in bilingual certified teachers and our special ed certified teachers. So I think we would love to see more innovative approaches, residencies, grow your own approaches like the one in Tennessee, apprenticeships, others that can help to bring and surge more of that workforce, and a renewed compact with our parents to do more to help support their success in schools. So, we're trying to put forth efforts and resources to that end. One of the things I'm just hoping we won't see as part of this pandemic, there's no need for us to recreate the wheel and reinvent the wheel 14,000 times across every school district in our country. We have models of what we know works, and we don't have to go to a one-size-fits-all approach either. We can localize those models, but let's follow that evidence, and we brought together folks virtually from around the country in a summit last week to really start to go deeper on how can we bring some of these strategies forward and follow the evidence and follow the lessons that our systems are implementing and that our state leaders are implementing today.
Great, thank you. So we've tried to cover a lot in this hour. Obviously, there's so much more to discuss and so much more to do. But as we near the end of the hour, I want to pose this question and give each panelist a moment to respond. And that is, as we go forward, there are absolutely things we can do to try to address the disruption, the trauma, the challenges our students are facing. So I ask each one of you, where's the hope that we can take with us as we leave this Asquith Forum? Aaliyah, would you start?
Sure. I would say not to underestimate the power of our own concentric circles for change. We can't look to the right or the left and expect everyone else to take some ownership in driving towards this change. Each of us in our own communities, in the chairs that we sit, and those that we engage with, are opportunities to make change. And I think about the quote, if not me, who? If not now, when? All of us are in leadership positions in some way or another, and the future of our society is depending on it. So use the power that you have to continue to create change.
Thank you so much. And Penny, what's the one thing that gives you hope?
Being in classrooms and seeing our teachers and our students. Today is National Teacher Day. I would be remiss if I didn't say that. And I've been in over 450 schools in our state, and I think every single classroom I learned something new. But if you see students, they want to be there, they're excited to be there, they are engaged. And if you've got kids ready to learn and teachers ready to teach, then it is our job to do right by them. And I'm very, very inspired by the work happening in our classrooms every day. And frankly, by the people on this call who are pushing me, whether it's through data and research, through thinking about the whole child and how we support full recovery, or frankly, holding states accountable to doing right by kids. So there's a lot of good happening in education, genuinely across the board.
Thank you so much. Roberto.
So well said, Penny. Couldn't agree more. I take my hope from the tremendous educators that have been on the front lines of this pandemic, keeping our young people fed and keeping them and supporting their learning and their development and connecting with their families. I had the honor of being with our Teachers of the Year last week in advance of today's Teacher Appreciation Day, and just the tremendous example that they set for what we can be as a country when we invest the resources and prioritize the learning and the education of our children. So I take hope in their leadership and in the leadership of our state leaders and our local leaders. They're doing the hard work every day of making sure that this recovery is equitable and that it delivers for all of our kids.
Great, thank you so much. And Tom, I want to give you the final word.
Sure. So I think there is lots of reason for optimism. As Roberto mentioned before, the department has done a good job, and other sites have done a good job of describing what kinds of interventions are available and what magnitude effect to expect from them. What we need to do now is it's all about magnitudes. So you wouldn't try to patch a hole without first measuring the hole and making sure that your patch is big enough to cover the hole. And so districts need to sit down and see what's the magnitude of the loss their students have achieved, have seen, and then add up the evidence on the effects of high dosage tutoring and after school and double dose and SEL interventions, and just make sure that that the recovery plan is commensurate with students' losses, because we're not going to have a chance to we don't have time to discover that what we're doing now is just way undersized. And from what I've seen, there are a lot of way undersized plans out there, and we need to correct that in the next few months.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and happy National Teacher Appreciation Day to all the educators out there. Thank you so much for everything that you do. We appreciate it. Take care.